The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of papers. Every eye in the boardroom was fixed on the scene unfolding at the front. Marcus Caldwell, the formidable CEO of Caldwell Enterprises, stood at the head of the polished mahogany table, his tailored suit immaculate, his presence commanding as always. But today, something was different. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his jaw tight, and his eyes, those piercing eyes that had closed billion-dollar deals, were locked on a woman standing silently at the back of the room. Isabella Monroe, dressed in a simple navy blazer, her hair pulled back in a modest bun, stood with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The tension was palpable, a live wire running through the room. Then, in a moment that would be whispered about for years, Marcus did the unthinkable. He stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor, and bowed deeply before her. A collective gasp rippled through the company's top executives. The man who never apologized, who never bent, was humbling himself in front of the entire company, and in front of her, a woman they all knew had been fired 3 years ago. Isabella didn't move. Her eyes, dark and steady, held his, but there was no triumph in her gaze, no gloating. There was something else, something deeper, something that made the room feel smaller, heavier. Marcus straightened, his voice low but clear, carrying the weight of a confession. "I was wrong," he said. "I failed you. And I failed this company by letting you go." The words hung in the air, sharp and raw, slicing through the polished veneer of the corporate world. Whispers broke out among the executives, but Isabella remained still, her silence louder than any response. The photograph on the table, a faded image of a younger Isabella, smiling beside a man who bore a striking resemblance to Marcus, seemed to pulse with a story no one in the room fully understood. Why was she here? Why had she returned after being cast out? And why, of all things, was Marcus Caldwell bowing to her? The boardroom's glass walls reflected the city skyline, glittering under the late afternoon sun, but inside, time seemed to freeze. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he gestured toward the photograph, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "You deserved better," he said. "And I'm asking, begging, for a chance to make it right." Isabella's lips parted, but she didn't speak. Her fingers brushed the edge of the photograph, a fleeting touch that carried years of unspoken pain. The executives shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the two. They knew the rumors. Isabella had been a rising star, a brilliant strategist who'd been unceremoniously fired after a mysterious falling out with Marcus. Some said she'd crossed him, others whispered she'd known too much. But none of them had expected this. None of them had expected her to return, let alone to stand here as Marcus humbled himself before her. Outside, the city buzzed on, oblivious to the drama unfolding 30 floors above. A delivery truck honked, a siren wailed in the distance, but in the boardroom, the world was reduced to this moment. Isabella's gaze flickered to the photograph again, to the man who wasn't Marcus but whose eyes mirrored his. Her chest rose and fell, a silent battle raging within her. She could walk away now, leave him in his shame, let the past stay buried. But something held her here, something stronger than anger, deeper than pride. The executives leaned forward, hanging on the edge of her silence, waiting for her to speak, to forgive, or to destroy him. And then, in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, she said, "You don't get to decide what I deserve anymore." The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the room. Marcus's face fell, his eyes searching hers for a flicker of mercy, but she gave him none. Not yet. 3 months earlier, the city had been cloaked in the gray of early spring, the kind of damp chill that seeped into your bones. Isabella had walked into the Caldwell Enterprises tower for the first time since her firing, her steps measured, her heart pounding. She wasn't the same woman who'd left 3 years ago, humiliated and broken. She carried herself differently now, taller, steadier, with a quiet strength that came from rebuilding a life from ashes. The receptionist barely recognized her, but the security guard, an older man named Henry, gave her a small nod, his eyes kind but curious. "Didn't think we'd see you again," Ms. Monroe," he said softly. Isabella smiled faintly, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "Neither did I," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. She'd come for a shareholder meeting, an event she'd been invited to as a formality. But Isabella wasn't here for pleasantries. In her bag was a document that would change everything, a contract proving she now held a significant stake in Caldwell Enterprises, acquired through a series of quiet, calculated moves over the past 2 years. She'd bought shares through proxies, leveraged connections she'd built in exile, and turned her pain into power. The boardroom was half full when she arrived, the executives too engrossed in their agendas to notice her slip in. Marcus was at the front, his voice crisp as he outlined the company's next quarter. He hadn't seen her yet, hadn't felt the shift in the air. But when their eyes met across the room, his words faltered, just for a moment. The man who never flinched looked like he'd seen a ghost. Isabella took her place at the back, her presence a silent challenge. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The document in her bag was her voice, her weapon, her redemption. The executives began to notice her, their whispers growing as they recognized the woman who'd once been one of them. Marcus regained his composure, but his eyes kept drifting to her, a flicker of unease betraying his polished facade. He didn't know yet what she held, didn't know the storm she'd brought with her. But he felt it. Isabella could see it in the way his fingers gripped the edge of the table, in the way his smile didn't reach his eyes. She'd spent 3 years preparing for this moment, and now, standing in the shadow of his empire, she was ready to make him feel the weight of his own mistakes. The meeting dragged on, numbers and projections filling the air, but Isabella's mind was elsewhere. She thought of the night she'd been fired, the way Marcus had stood in his office, his voice cold as he told her she was no longer needed. She'd been too stunned to argue, too broken to fight back. But that night had planted a seed, a fire that grew with every rejection, every door slammed in her face. She'd clawed her way back, not just to survive, but to stand here, in this room, as his equal. The photograph in her bag, the one she'd later place on the table, was a reminder of why she'd fought. It wasn't just about her. It was about the man in the picture, the one who believed in her when Marcus hadn't, the one whose legacy she was carrying forward. As the meeting ended, Marcus approached her, his steps cautious, his voice low. "Isabella," he said, her name sounding foreign on his tongue. "What are you doing here?" She met his gaze, her eyes unflinching. "I'm a shareholder now," she said simply, her voice calm but laced with steel. "I have every right to be here." His face tightened, a flash of something, fear, guilt, anger, crossing his features. He didn't know the half of it yet. He didn't know that the woman he'd cast out had become the one who could unravel his empire. And as she walked away, leaving him standing in the wake of her words, Isabella felt the first stirrings of a victory she hadn't dared imagine 3 years ago. The city was a different beast 3 years ago, its pulse slower, its shadows softer under the weight of a late autumn dusk. Isabella Monroe was not yet the woman who'd stand silently in the boardroom, a shareholder with the power to shake an empire. She was still a rising star at Caldwell Enterprises, a strategist whose ideas lit up meeting rooms, whose quiet confidence made even the most jaded executives take notice. Her office was small but meticulously organized, a corner of the 32nd floor where she'd pinned sketches of marketing campaigns to the walls, her desk cluttered with coffee cups and dog-eared notebooks. She was 29, ambitious but not ruthless, her eyes bright with the kind of hope that hadn't yet been tested by betrayal. The city stretched out beyond her window, a glittering promise of everything she was working toward. But that autumn, the promise began to crack. Isabella's days were long, her nights longer. She'd stay late, poring over data, crafting pitches that would carry Caldwell Enterprises into new markets. Marcus Caldwell noticed her early on. He'd stop by her desk, his presence filling the room, his questions sharp but laced with a rare approval. "You're going places, Isabella," he'd say, his voice smooth, his smile calculated. She believed him, not because she was naive, but because she'd earned it. Her work spoke for itself, revenue up 12%, a campaign that went viral, a deal with a European firm that had eluded the company for years. She was good, and she knew it. But she didn't see the shadow creeping closer, didn't hear the whispers in the boardroom, didn't know that her light was casting a threat. The first sign came in a meeting, one of those endless strategy sessions where egos clashed and coffee grew cold. Isabella presented a bold plan to pivot the company's branding, a move that would disrupt their traditional image but open new revenue streams. The room was quiet as she spoke, her slides crisp, her voice steady. When she finished, Marcus leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, his eyes unreadable. "Ambitious," he said, the word hanging like a blade. The other executives nodded, but their smiles were tight, their glances darting to Marcus. Later, in the hallway, a colleague named Evelyn pulled her aside. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice low. "You're stepping on toes you don't even see." Isabella brushed it off, chalking it up to corporate politics. She'd faced skepticism before. She could handle it. But the air was shifting, and Isabella felt it in the way Marcus's visits to her desk grew less frequent, in the way her emails went unanswered, in the way her ideas were quietly sidelined. She worked harder, stayed later, pushed herself to prove she belonged. She didn't know then that Marcus was meeting with a man named Victor, a consultant whose name carried weight in the industry. Victor was older, charismatic, with a knack for turning struggling companies around. He was also the man in the photograph, the one whose eyes mirrored Marcus's, though Isabella wouldn't discover that until much later. Victor saw her work, saw her potential, and unlike Marcus, he didn't see a threat. He saw a partner. Victor and Isabella met by chance in the company's cafeteria, a rare moment when she wasn't buried in work. He was there to meet Marcus, but their meeting had been delayed, and he'd wandered downstairs, a cup of coffee in hand. Isabella was at a table, sketching in her notebook, her lunch untouched. "You're the one behind the European deal," he said, his voice warm, not a question. She looked up, startled, then nodded. "That's me." They talked for an hour, about strategy, about the industry, about the kind of bold moves that could redefine a company. Victor listened, really listened, his eyes bright with the kind of respect Isabella hadn't felt in months. When he left, he slipped her his card. "If you ever need a mentor," he said, "call me." She tucked the card into her notebook, not knowing it would become a lifeline. Their conversations continued, brief but meaningful, in the margins of her days. Victor was a guest at Caldwell Enterprises, advising on a restructuring plan, and he made a point to seek her out. He'd ask about her work, challenge her ideas, share stories of his own failures and triumphs. He was different from Marcus, less polished, more human, his laughter easy, his advice sharp but kind. Isabella felt seen, not as a cog in the machine, but as someone with a future. She didn't know that Victor was Marcus's older brother, estranged for years, brought back to stabilize the company after a string of bad decisions. She didn't know that Marcus watched their interactions with a growing unease, his pride bruised by the brother who'd always outshone him, his control threatened by the woman who was winning Victor's respect. The tension came to a head on a Friday evening, the office nearly empty, the city outside cloaked in fog. Isabella was in her office, finalizing a presentation, when Marcus appeared at her door. His face was a mask, his voice cold. "We need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. What followed was a conversation that would haunt her for years. He accused her of overstepping, of undermining his authority, of aligning herself with Victor to push her own agenda. "You're talented," he said, his words sharp, "but you're not indispensable." Isabella tried to defend herself, her voice shaking, but Marcus wasn't listening. He'd made up his mind. By the end of the night, her badge was revoked, her office cleared, her dreams shattered. "You'll land on your feet," he said as she left, but his eyes were empty, his tone final. She walked out into the fog, her coat too thin, her hands trembling as she clutched her notebook. The city felt foreign now, its lights blurred by the tears she refused to let fall. She didn't know that Victor had tried to intervene, that he'd argued with Marcus in a heated exchange that left their fragile truce in tatters. She didn't know that Marcus's decision wasn't just about her work, it was about power, about proving he was still in control, about erasing the threat of a woman who dared to shine too brightly. All she knew was the weight of rejection, the sting of betrayal, the silence of a dream that had slipped through her fingers. In her apartment that night, a cramped studio with peeling paint, Isabella sat on the floor, her notebook open to Victor's card. She didn't call him, not yet. She was too raw, too proud. But she kept the card, tucking it into the photograph she'd found in her desk, a picture of her and Victor, taken at a company event, his arm around her shoulder, both of them smiling. It was a small thing, a moment frozen in time, but it held her together when everything else was falling apart. And as the city slept outside her window, Isabella made a promise to herself. She wouldn't let this define her. She wouldn't let Marcus win. She didn't know how, didn't know when, but she would rise again, and when she did, he would see what he'd lost. The city was colder 2 years after Isabella's firing, its winter skies heavy with the threat of snow. Isabella Monroe was no longer the woman who'd walked out of Caldwell Enterprises with a notebook and a broken dream. She was 31 now, her ambition tempered by resilience, her hope sharpened by survival. She lived in a modest apartment on the city's edge, a place with creaky floors and a view of the river, where she'd built a new life from the wreckage Marcus Caldwell had left behind. Her days were filled with freelance consulting, late-night strategy sessions, and a quiet determination that burned brighter than ever. The photograph of her and Victor, the man who'd believed in her, sat on her desk, a reminder of the promise she'd made to herself. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Isabella's world had shrunk in those first months after her firing, the sting of rejection following her like a shadow. The industry was small, and Marcus's influence was vast. Doors that once opened for her slammed shut, her name whispered in boardrooms as a cautionary tale. But Isabella was a fighter, even when the fight felt impossible. She took on small clients, startups, nonprofits, anyone who'd listen to her ideas, and slowly, her reputation began to rebuild. She worked from coffee shops, her laptop a lifeline, her mind racing with plans. It was in one of those coffee shops, a cramped place with mismatched chairs, that she reconnected with Victor. He'd found her by chance, or so it seemed, though Isabella would later wonder if he'd been looking for her all along. She was sketching in her notebook, a habit that grounded her, when he slid into the seat across from her. "Still drawing your way to the top?" he asked, his voice warm, his smile unchanged by the years. Isabella looked up, her heart skipping a beat. Victor was older now, his hair streaked with gray, but his eyes still held that spark, that belief in her that had kept her afloat in her darkest days. They talked for hours, the coffee growing cold, the city fading around them. He told her about his own battles, about his falling out with Marcus, about the brother he'd once loved but could no longer reach. "He's scared of you," Victor said, his voice low. "Always was. You're too good, Isabella. Too real." Their conversations became a lifeline, a bridge between her past and the future she was clawing toward. Victor wasn't just a mentor now, he was a partner, a collaborator who saw her not as a threat but as an equal. He introduced her to his network, a web of industry insiders who valued results over politics. Through him, Isabella began acquiring shares in Caldwell Enterprises, small at first, then larger, using proxies to mask her moves. It was a risky play, one that drained her savings and kept her up at night, but Victor was with her every step, his faith unwavering. "You're not just taking back what's yours," he told her one evening, his hand resting on hers. "You're building something new." Isabella nodded, her throat tight. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the man who'd stood by her, for the legacy he'd entrusted to her. Victor's health was failing, though he hid it well. Isabella noticed the way he tired quickly, the way his hands shook when he thought she wasn't looking. He was in his late 50s, but the years had worn him down, the stress of a life spent navigating corporate wars taking its toll. One night, over dinner in a quiet restaurant, he slid a folder across the table. "This is for you," he said, his voice steady but heavy. Inside was a will, naming her as the beneficiary of his remaining shares in Caldwell Enterprises. Isabella's breath caught, her eyes burning. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Victor smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Because you'll do what I couldn't," he said. "You'll make it right." The weight of his trust settled over her, a mantle she wasn't sure she could carry. But she didn't have time to doubt herself. Victor's condition worsened, and soon, he was in the hospital, his visits with Isabella confined to sterile rooms and quiet moments. She'd sit by his bedside, reading him industry reports, sharing her plans, trying to keep the spark in his eyes alive. He'd listen, his hand gripping hers, his voice weak but firm. "Don't let Marcus win," he'd say, and Isabella would nod, her jaw tight, her heart breaking. When he passed, 6 months before her return to Caldwell Enterprises, Isabella was alone in her apartment, the photograph of them on her desk, her tears falling silently. She didn't grieve loudly. She grieved in action, pouring herself into her plan, into the shares, into the future Victor had believed in. The city's winter deepened, the river outside her window freezing at the edges. Isabella's network grew, her moves bolder. She met with investors, negotiated deals, and quietly amassed enough shares to secure a seat at the shareholder meeting. Each step was a defiance of the man who'd cast her out, a reclamation of the power he'd tried to strip from her. But it wasn't just about power. It was about justice, about proving that she was more than the failure Marcus had labeled her. The photograph became her talisman, a reminder of Victor's faith, of the man who'd seen her when Marcus hadn't. She carried it with her, tucked into her notebook, its edges worn from her touch. The night before the shareholder meeting, Isabella stood in her apartment, the city sprawling beyond her window. She was nervous, though she'd never admit it. Her plan was solid, her shares enough to make Marcus listen, but the thought of facing him again, of standing in the room where he'd broken her, made her chest tighten. She opened her notebook, her fingers brushing the photograph. Victor's smile stared back at her, steady, unwavering. "You'll do what I couldn't," she whispered, echoing his words. She closed the notebook, her resolve hardening. Marcus didn't know what was coming. He didn't know that the woman he dismissed was now a force he couldn't ignore. In the quiet of her apartment, Isabella rehearsed her entrance, her words, her silence. She wouldn't shout or accuse. She'd let her presence speak, let her shares do the talking. She thought of Victor, of the brotherly rift that had shaped Marcus's cruelty, of the company that had been their battleground. She thought of the boardroom, of the executives who'd forgotten her, of the man who'd bowed to no one. And she knew, with a clarity that burned, that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she'd walk into Caldwell Enterprises not as the woman who'd been fired, but as the woman who'd risen. Tomorrow, Marcus would see her, and for the first time, he'd feel the weight of his own mistakes. The city was softer now, bathed in the golden light of a late summer evening, its skyline a quiet promise against the fading day. Isabella Monroe stood outside the Caldwell Enterprises tower, her navy blazer replaced by a simple white blouse, her hair loose around her shoulders. The weight of the past 3 years, her firing, her exile, her rise, felt lighter tonight, though it would never fully leave her. The photograph of her and Victor, the man who'd believed in her when the world hadn't, was tucked into her bag, a silent companion. She wasn't here to confront Marcus Caldwell anymore. She'd done that 3 months ago, in the boardroom where he'd bowed before her, his apology a crack in the armor of a man who'd never bent. Tonight, she was here for something else, something quieter, something that felt like closure. The shareholder meeting had changed everything, though not in the way Isabella had expected. She'd walked in with her shares, her proof of power, ready to demand accountability. But Marcus's bow, his raw confession in front of the company, had shifted the ground beneath her. His words, "I was wrong. I failed you," hadn't erased the pain, but they'd forced her to see him not as the untouchable CEO, but as a man haunted by his own choices. She hadn't forgiven him, not fully, but she'd felt the anger in her chest loosen, making room for something new. The executives had watched, stunned, as she'd left the photograph on the table, her silence louder than any speech. She'd walked out, her head high, knowing she'd reclaimed her place, not just in the company, but in her own story. In the weeks that followed, Marcus had tried to reach her. Emails, calls, even a handwritten letter delivered to her apartment. Isabella read the letter once, its words careful but heavy with regret, and set it aside. She wasn't ready to respond, wasn't sure she ever would be. But the company was changing. Marcus had stepped back from day-to-day operations, appointing a new COO, a woman Isabella respected, someone who'd quietly supported her in the early days. Policies shifted, too, more transparency, more opportunities for young talent, a nod to the kind of vision Isabella had once fought for. She didn't trust it completely, didn't trust Marcus's motives, but she saw Victor's influence in it, his belief that a company could be more than profit, more than power. Isabella's own role had grown, though she kept it low-key. As a major shareholder, she attended meetings, offered insights, but stayed out of the spotlight. She didn't want Marcus's empire. She wanted the one she was building herself, a consulting firm, small but growing, with clients who valued her for her mind, not her past. The city felt different now, less like a battlefield, more like a place where she could breathe. But there was one piece of her story still unresolved, one moment she hadn't faced. And tonight, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she knew it was time. The park across from the Caldwell Tower was quiet, its paths lined with trees just beginning to turn gold. Isabella walked slowly, her bag slung over her shoulder, her steps deliberate. She'd heard Marcus was here, attending a charity event the company was sponsoring, a small gesture, but one that carried his name. She didn't plan to confront him, didn't plan to speak at all. She just needed to see him, to close the circle that had begun the night he'd fired her. The event was in full swing when she arrived, a crowd of donors and employees mingling under string lights, laughter mixing with the clink of glasses. Isabella stayed at the edge, her presence unnoticed, her eyes scanning the crowd. Marcus was there, near a makeshift stage, his suit less pristine than usual, his posture looser. He was speaking to a group of young interns, his voice carrying a warmth she'd never associated with him. She watched, her heart steady but heavy, as he handed out scholarships, his smile genuine, his eyes catching the light. He looked different, older, softer, as if the weight of his apology had stripped away some of his armor. Isabella's fingers brushed the photograph in her bag, her mind drifting to Victor, to the brother Marcus had lost, to the man who'd shaped them both. She wondered if Marcus felt him here, too, in the quiet acts of redemption he was trying to make. A child ran past, her laughter breaking Isabella's thoughts. The girl, no older than 6, clutched a balloon, her dress bright against the fading light. She tripped, her balloon slipping from her hand, and Isabella knelt instinctively, catching it before it floated away. "Here you go," she said, handing it back, her voice soft. The girl grinned, then ran off, her mother calling after her. Isabella stood, her eyes following the child, and that's when she saw him, Marcus, watching her from across the crowd. Their gazes met, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just them, the noise of the event fading into a hum. He approached slowly, his hands in his pockets, his expression uncertain. "Isabella," he said, her name softer now, less like a challenge. She nodded, her arms crossing, her stance guarded but not hostile. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice low, almost tentative. Isabella tilted her head, her eyes steady. "I didn't expect to come," she replied, her words honest, unguarded. They stood in silence, the space between them filled with everything they hadn't said, his betrayal, her resilience, the photograph that had bound them to a man they'd both loved and lost. Marcus glanced at the crowd, then back at her, his jaw working as if searching for the right words. "I'm trying," he said finally, his voice rough. "To be better." For Victor. For you. Isabella's chest tightened, her fingers brushing the photograph in her bag. She thought of Victor's will, of his faith in her, of the company she was building on her own terms. She thought of the boardroom, of Marcus's bow, of the moment she'd reclaimed her power. And she realized she didn't need his redemption to move forward. She'd already found her own. "You don't owe me anything," she said, her voice calm, final. "But you owe it to yourself to keep trying." Marcus's eyes glistened, a flicker of something, gratitude, shame, hope, crossing his face. He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and for the first time, Isabella saw the man behind the CEO, the brother Victor had loved, the one who'd lost as much as she had. She didn't forgive him, not entirely, but she let go of the last thread of anger, let it drift away with the evening breeze. The event continued, the crowd oblivious to the quiet exchange that had just shifted something fundamental. Isabella turned to leave, her steps light, her heart steady. Marcus watched her go, his hands still in his pockets, his eyes following her until she disappeared into the twilight. He didn't call after her, didn't try to stop her. He knew she was no longer his to hold back. And as the city glowed around them, Isabella walked into the future she'd built, the photograph in her bag a reminder of the man who'd seen her, the woman she'd become, and the peace she'd finally claimed.